Welcome back to On the Workbench. Today we're under the hood of the 06 Saab 9.3, and today we're going to be replacing the valve cover gasket. So the valve cover is this part right here that surrounds the spark plug cover. We're going to be removing the valve cover, replacing the gasket on that, and then at the same time I'm also doing an oil change that I'm not going to include in this video. And because I have to remove the spark plugs to be able to actually remove my valve cover, maybe replacing the spark plugs as well, then I'm also going to be inspecting for where there is a chain, the upper chain guide that's located on this side of the engine, that I'm also bought a replacement part for just in case I need to replace it. It is kind of a wear item. It's better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. Let's take a look at the tools you're going to need for this project. There's actually going to be a handful of tools that are going to be necessary. So let's start from the back. Number one, we're going to need a 3/8 torque wrench. We're going to be using that for installing new spark plugs. We're going to need a 1/4 inch torque wrench for installing the valve cover back after we have the new gasket. I've got a couple other 3/8 ratchets here that are just useful to me. I've got this pivoting swivel head one that's great just for the extra mobility of trying to get the spark plugs out and just trying to be able to loosen the valve cover bolts from before. You also may want a flathead screwdriver, and by that I really mean a pry bar to help you get the valve cover off and to break the seal from the old gasket. You also may want another small flathead screwdriver to be able to help get the mass airflow sensor tubing out of the way. We're going to need a couple Torx drivers. We're going to use a T25 to open up the airbox and a T30 to remove the engine cover and the spark plug covers. And then when it comes to the chrome department, we're going to need a 10mm wrench. There's one specific bolt that's going to require the wrench as opposed to a socket. And then because of that same obstruction and the need for the torque wrench, we're also going to need a 10mm crow's foot. And in this case here, I only have a 3/8 crow's foot, so I'm going to go in 3/8 crow's foot, the 1/4 inch adapter. And then I've got a deep 10mm, and then another 3/8 10mm, and then a 1/4 inch 10mm with a couple extra 1/4 inch extensions for dealing with the valve cover bolts, and then a 5/8 spark plug socket for removal of the spark plug, 3/8 extension to go on the end of the spark plug socket for removing that. I also have my hose clamp pliers. These are the cable driven style hose clamp pliers for removing the PCV hose. I also have a pair of needle nose pliers. You may or may not need these just to be able to pull up any debris in case you drop a bolt or a nut somewhere that you shouldn't drop it. Having a pair of needle nose pliers on hand is always useful, or any other grabbing tool, as well as safety glasses. You also may want gloves and the like, just to be able to protect yourself. And then you're also going to want some form of parts trays to keep track of the screws, because at some point you're going to have about 14 valve cover screws. You're going to have some other screws to adjust some electrical wiring. You're going to have the screws from the spark plug cover and from the front of the engine cover. And you have a couple other 10mm bolts that go with some of the wiring you got to remove, so having some parts trays to keep that organized. Or you could also use, if you want to raid your wife's kitchen or your own kitchen, get a muffin pan. That would work as well. A couple magnetic trays will do the same thing. Some shop towels, and that's about it for the tools. So I don't really think it's quite as bad as it looks here. And as far as time, I'd budget about 4 hours for this job, maybe a little more depending upon how quickly you work. And how detailed you want to be with trying to clean your valve cover before you put it back on. And so for the cleaning of that, you also may want a wire brush. You may want some Scotch-Brite pads or something else to be able to kind of polish or buff that. That's going to be entirely up to you for how pristine and perfect you want that to look. And that's really going to be where you can add a fair bit of time to this. You also may want to consider, the other tools you would need for doing an oil change. But, I'm only showing here what's essential for doing the job of replacing the valve covered gasket. The parts that we're going to use for this project, or at least the principal parts that we're going to use, is a new set of gaskets. So the gaskets here is going to consist of the big valve cover gasket, as well as 4 little gaskets that cover each of the spark plug holes. So we've got a brand new gasket here. We'll have to get that lubed up. And then we're going to have to pull the spark plug, so we're going to pull the spark plugs. We might as well get a set of 4 brand new spark plugs and replace those. It just makes sense to replace the spark plugs while we're at it. And then this is optional, but something I thought I would at least buy in case it came up. And this is the upper chain guide that if you're going to remove the valve cover, you can get to this product very easily. And then, because the timing chain rides right under here, there's a little piece of plastic here that in the event that there's any wear on the one that's on the car, I at least think it'd be nice to be able to have this ready just in case. You know, it's better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. I checked my local auto parts stores and none of them had this part in stock. It is if you can see from the bag here carefully, this is a regular GM, genuine GM part. And so you may be able to obtain this locally in the event that you decided that you needed it. In my case, I decided that I would just go ahead and order it, and if I didn't need it, I'll just set it aside. It was like maybe 30 bucks, but that was $30 of insurance, and if I don't need it, I'll see if I can return it. In addition to the tools, there's a couple chemicals that you're probably going to want for this job. First of all, let's start with the brake clean. You may want some brake clean for being able to scrub down the valve cover after you get it removed. It's great for cleaning. Some folks may need to go with the non-chlorinated version, but I prefer the chlorinated version. I've got some super lube synthetic grease for being able to grease up the new valve cover. And then you can go with some dielectric grease and anti-seize for replacing the spark plugs. And then if you're using those, you also may want some gloves for your hands so your hands don't look all dirty and nasty, and to be able to protect your skin. And then with those chemicals in hand, the parts in hand, and the tools in hand, you may also want a wire brush. You may want some Scotch-Brite pads, some shop towels to be able to help kind of wipe this stuff up and clean up after yourself. And obviously some soap and water to clean up before you go back in the house with some good strong hand cleaner. Now we can go over to the car and get started on this project. So then to get started, we're going to use a T30 screwdriver to remove the hex bolts here covering the spark plug cover and the front engine cover. And then we're also going to end up removing the airbox as well. This is the perfect time to also replace the air filter. This is a couple other little miscellaneous parts here that all kind of get wrapped up, as this is the perfect time to do that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start removing the screws on the top of the engine. With the other screws removed and the covers removed, I'm going to take a T25 Torx driver and remove the lid to my airbox. And we're going to remove the airbox assembly as well. Once I'm doing this, I'm also going to be replacing the air filter. And then now the next thing is we need to be able to remove this top lid from back here, because this is going to catch on the back corner here of our valve cover. And so then we can use a straight or a flat screwdriver to undo that hose clamp. And then we're just going to swing this aside. We've got our mass airflow sensor here. We could disconnect it, but we can just set it aside. We've got our air filter here. This one's actually in pretty good shape, so maybe I won't replace this. But I bought a replacement just in case. And then our air box is just basically, there's a rubber grommet back here that this pulls out of. And then there's a rubber grommet here at the bottom that we're going to do the exact same thing with. And then that just slides up like that. Obviously this is a good time to clean out the airbox cover. I got some debris in there, so we'll clean that out before we replace that later. And now I'm going to have full access to the side of my valve cover. But the next thing we got to do is remove the coil pack. So we got 1, 2, 3, and 4 that we need to remove. Next, I've got 4 coil pack bolts to remove with a 10mm socket. And then to remove the coil packs, we can just pull them out one by one. And then I can just start folding these back. And then now we've got our coil packs out of the way. Then now in the back, we've got a PCV hose here that we're going to need to use a pair of hose clamp pliers to remove. You could also use a pair of regular pliers to unclip it. There we go, there's our PCV hose. The next thing, using a deep well 10mm, we're going to need to disconnect this cable harness here, because there's going to be one bolt over here on your right side that we need to get out. Oh, we dropped that. We'll get that out with some needle nose pliers. And there's one more bolt I almost forgot. That is tucked away over here that we have to get to be able to get this removed. And then there's one more screw right down in front here that we're going to have to be able to also remove, or a bolt, I guess I should say, to be able to get this out of the way to loosen up this wiring loom here. And now that we've got that bolt off, and now that's loosened just enough I can get a socket down here for the valve cover. So now we've got about all the corners of the valve cover pulled off. Now it's time to actually start removing the valve cover itself. And so now, after loosening this up here, the last step is going to be to actually remove the spark plugs. So we're going to remove these out of the holes one by one. This one, there's finally number 4. Not sure why that one had to be a little more tricky, but that's it. And now for the location of the valve cover bolts to remove, we're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4 here across the front, 1, 2, 3, 4 across the middle, 1, 2, 3, 4 across the back. So we've got 12 screws to remove. Each of those is going to go back in, and because the torque on these is pretty low, I'm expecting this to actually come out relatively easily. All right, so then we're going to start just working our way around. This is just a 10mm socket. These are held in by a very low amount of torque. When we put these back in, we're going to torque them very carefully, working our way around. I'm just going to work around and start breaking them loose. You can see these even have a little boot on them. All right, here comes the moment of truth. I've went around. I think I've got all the bolts out here, so I feel good about that, I think. And now it's time to start prying on and lifting up the valve cover gasket. So, wish me luck. So let's take a look and see what we see on my engine here after the valve cover is off. First of all, we can see this one gasket here still sticking right here. So we're going to have to get that cleaned up here, because we're going to want to get all of that so we're not double gasketing anything. I'm not putting debris down, but overall I feel pretty good. I'm going to double check to make sure everything looks good in terms of rockers, pistons, and trying to just double check for any unusual exhaust or these valve wears, but I think everything looks generally okay. And the other magic piece I want to inspect is going to be this upper chain guide here to make sure it is still good. Now let's look at the top of this. So here's the valve cover that I pulled off. You can see there's some film on here. I'm going to clean this up with some brake clean. Then we'll have to pull off the gasket that goes all the way around it. And then we'll be able to put in our new gasket and pull out the other of these spark plug seals to be able to make everything work good. With the valve cover gasket on the floor and a piece of cardboard, it's time to break out the brake clean. And then a Scotch-Brite pad and scrub this down and get it all cleaned up and shined up so we can then put the gasket and put this all back together. A quick check, there are 14 valve cover screws. Each of the screws has this little rubber grommet on it. And so there are 14 of them for your parts counting. All right, for inventory purposes, we've got 6 of these bolts that we removed with the 10mm socket. We've got 4 more nuts that we also removed with the 10mm socket. Then we've got one other quirky bolt here that's actually a stud that has a 10mm in the middle to help you set it. And of course there was also the PCV hose clamp that we had. The other screws here are for the spark plug cover, and the other one is for the lower engine cover. Looking at the chain guide that's on my car here, it actually interesting. This one actually has an extra clip that my replacement one does not in the middle. It feels solid. It doesn't feel fragile or that it's or worn at all, so I'm just going to leave it. I know there's a little bit of varnish on it. I know there's a little oil on it, but that's no big deal, and the varnish is just going to be part and parcel for the course for any part like that. And so now that we've got everything taken off here and cleaned up, now it's going to be time to refit the gasket into the valve cover and then drop it back on. One other detail you may not have seen that I did off camera is I also ended up removing the the turbo heat shield so I could get the valve cover out from underneath there, and just for refitment purposes. Also in the removal process, be very careful with the wiring harness over here, just to make sure you don't put any extra stress on the wiring harness for getting that off and trying to get it all seated. You've got these studs here to be able to work things around, so just be very careful. I've also wiped down as much of the mating surface as I can with a cloth here just to try to get it all dry and as clean as possible for being able to reseat properly. And then just inspecting the camshafts, I feel pretty good about everything. I think things look relatively good. I don't see any amounts of excess wear. You can see some shiny spots on the cams, but they don't seem to be wearing excessively. I might give this just a little bit of a clean, and then we'll get everything put back together. So now I've got the brand new valve cover gasket here laid out just out of the package, just to kind of let it sit out here for just a bit and try to undo any memory from the packaging. But just for comparison, I've got the valve cover gasket here that I had removed, and a lot of it's still pliable, but there's a spot, let's see if I can find it here, like this got really hard and crunchy. There's a few spots along the back edge that are just really hard and brittle, and I believe I was actually having a small oil leak out of the back of this valve cover gasket because it had just gotten really hard and brittle, and there was a leak somewhere because I know the oil was coming out of it, and that's why I diagnosed this as needing a new valve cover gasket, as obviously you shouldn't have oil just seeping through and out. Like some of these back parts here are just really, really hard. And like right here, this is super brittle, where this is hard just like plastic. It's not even soft or compressible or pliable, just like on the new one here. This has a little bit of play. Definitely feels like a gasket. This feels like just hardened plastic here, where there's that tear. And so it was not acting like a gasket, it was just acting, well, like anything but a gasket. So now after cleaning the valve cover with brake clean and a little bit of elbow grease, I know it's not perfect, I got a lot of the varnish off and the imperfections. Now it comes time for the gasket. After letting this gasket sitting on my workbench here to kind of stretch out and release it from the memory, one of the things that you'll notice if you look at these is it's easy to see on the spark plug parts here that there is a top and a bottom. There's a narrow channel, a narrow side to this that goes into the valve cover, and the wide side will go down against the engine. But to make sure everything is all good and that these stay soft and pliable, I'm going to be using superglue, multi-purpose synthetic grease, to be able to lube these up by hand. And so I'm just going to give a little grease here on it and then wipe them down, because I don't want these hardening up. I want them to be actually doing the job properly. And then these 4 on the spark plugs are interchangeable, and they seat right down in like that. This will provide a little bit of tackiness to also help hold these down when it comes to setting this on top of our engine. So I'm just going to lather, rinse, and repeat. Obviously you want to make sure before you get started that you actually have all of these spark plugs, that for some reason you didn't get shorted a spark plug gasket, because there should be basically 5 gasket parts in your set, 1 for each spark plug hole and then 1 for the outside of the valve cover. So again, I'm just going to lube these up by hand, get them all greased up here so that the rubber stays soft and pliable, and we get a nice, good seal. That'll prevent vacuum leaks, exhaust leaks, and help our engine to run the way that it's supposed to. Prevent oil loss. And so there we go. There's all 4 of those. Now, as you think about the valve cover here, this is a 3-dimensional object because you've got a groove that goes down here. You've got ridges on the other side over here. So when it comes time to putting this on, this valve cover does have some bit of a 3D nature to it that you may want to kind of pick it up and play with it to make sure you get it right before you get it lubed up, so that you've got the ridges on the right side and the valleys on the correct side as well as the correct up and down side to the gasket. There's a fair bit of just the cracks and the nooks and the valleys, and the top of each of these ridges. Let me move the camera up. At the top of each of the ridges over here, there is a little called a little alignment pin on the gasket and on the head. So you can see we've got this here, but now we need to lube it up. So now I'm just going to kind of work this lube in here piece by piece, section by section, as I go around and getting it seated. So now after super lubing the gasket, I just want to point out the little indentations at either end. You can see there's a little key right here and a key right there on this end of the gasket. And if we turn the valve cover around, there's a key on the ridge as well, just to help to get everything pinned in. The grease here should help to hold this on when we go to place this into the car. And remember, we've got a very specific way that this goes. And one of the things we'll be able to key off of is we've got the, right back here, if you can see my finger, is the oil fill plug. And so we know where that goes, and this goes over our timing chain. And so now let's go over to the car and get it set up. So now to replace the bolts, I'm going to go ahead and just start these and get them loose before I actually get them, bring them up to torque, just to make sure I get all of them in place. And I remember where they all go. And I'm going to make sure I try to do this in kind of a crisscross pattern. Hopefully I can just hand tighten these down a little bit here, because it's going to be important that I get all 12 of these accounted for. I don't want to miss one of these. That would not be a good day. Let's see, where's another good one? Let's go to this back corner back here. Up front, there actually is no official pattern on this, which I'm kind of surprised about. I would have thought there would have been an official tightening pattern. But again, first of all, I'm just trying to get this started, make sure I get all the bolts in. Then I can remember exactly where all the bolts go. Part of this is also just making sure that everything lines up correctly. You can see I'm just doing these by hand. With this many holes, it's important to check the alignment, and you can also use the alignment pins on each end of the guide as you set it in to double check that the gasket is still properly aligned. And now for the most annoying bolt of them all, it's going to be the one that goes in this front corner here that we're going to have to play a little bit of games with trying to get this on right and be able to work around the fuel rails. And so this is one of those bolts here that we're going to have to do with a ratchet. I'm sorry, with a ratcheting wrench. I can at least get this started with hand. And when it comes to bringing this to final torque, we're going to be using a crow's foot for that. Okay, so we got that one. Now that we've got all of our valve cover gaskets in, it's time to break out the 1/4-inch torque wrench, and we're going to set this to 96 inch-pounds or 8 foot-pounds, and then bring these bolts to final torque. And in doing so, we're going to go in a crisscross pattern around, just like I was kind of installing it here, to make sure we get even clamping pressure all the way around the valve cover. And then now to torque the final one here, I've got a crow's foot here. All I've got is a 3/8 crow's foot here, 1/4-inch adapter, 1/4-inch extension. The key is putting this at a right angle or 90 degrees to the torque wrench, so I'm not inadvertently increasing the beam of the wrench, and therefore throwing off the calibration. Making sure this is hand tight, at least close first. You can see we got torque there. Now I'm going to go around and double check that we got torque on all of the rest of them. Now with all the valve cover bolts back in, now it's time to replace some of this electrical harness and put it back where it belongs. Now that one double-ended bolt or stud actually goes right here on the inside, so let me get that one first. And then now we've got our 10mm nuts that we can put on. We've got the two up here in the front. There is no torque spec for these, just get them nice and tight. And then another one of those 10mm nuts goes right up here on the little chase that goes with the other bits of the wiring. That goes into that stud that we installed earlier. And then my last bolt actually goes, see if I can get a good camera angle here. Hopefully there's some lighting. Goes right here. I removed this one just to give myself a little more room and those wires a little bit more play. Maybe that one may or may not have been necessary, but I removed that one anyway. All right, that's all 4 of the bolts. I'm sorry, that's all 4 of the nuts. Now we've got a handful of these other nuts to get in place. So now out of our 6 remaining 10, or I guess they're really 8mm bolts, we've got 4 that are full thread. Those are for a coil pack. Our last 2 that are not full thread are going to be used to hold on this cable and fuel cluster on the passenger side of the engine. And so this one goes right up here up front, and the other one will go right in the back. Start it by hand to avoid cross-threading. And then there's another one of these right back here. That one's good and tight. All right, so now we got the wires back on, the valve cover back on. The next step is to get the 2 bolts on the back of the turbo heat shield. I took those off camera earlier. They go on with the same 10mm socket. Here's the bolts for the turbocharger. You see I set these aside separately, and you see how these have the lack of full thread at the end. The next piece I want to install, I'm going to use the hose clamp pliers and get out the connector for the PCV hose. And then we're going to close that up here to expand it out. There we go. That should give us enough room. I love these cable pliers. They just give me a lot of extra room to work with this. So now the next step is to reattach the PCV hose. I've got my clamp back into my hose pliers. I'm going to slide this onto the hose and then onto the engine cover. And then once I got it there, I'll just let it get seated. And now we've got our PCV hose back onto our engine cover there. Just the way that goes. And now the next step is to reinstall the spark plugs. In this case here, I'm going to be going with brand new spark plugs because why not? I've got the cover apart. Let's just do new spark plugs. So those are 30 foot-pounds a piece. Put some anti-seize on them and some dielectric grease. And so let's do that next. I'll probably just show the first one and then same process for the rest of them. All right, so I got the anti-seize on the end of the spark plug here. I'm just going to start this one by hand. I always think starting spark plugs by hand is a smart idea. You never want to risk cross-threading. That's not going to be final torque, but it's at least started by hand. Repeat the process for the other 3 spark plugs. My torque wrench set to 20 foot-pounds. I'm going to come back here and torque the spark plugs into place. There we go. Now for each coil pack going on, I'm going to be taking a shop towel and just kind of wiping down anything on it. And then I'll apply some fresh dielectric grease just to ensure the spark stays where you want it. There's the far coil pack. Time for the next one. And now with all the coil packs lubricated with dielectric grease, we're going to go ahead and work these all the way down. And when they're all the way down, the top of the pack will sit down, and you can put a bolt, the 10mm down into it to be able to secure the coil pack. We're just going to secure, make sure all those connections are tight. Now we can put the spark plug cover back on. That's going to go like that. Now we've got our 4 torque screws to set in here. Then we can tighten up with a T30 screwdriver. Now the next step is to put on our oil fill cap, and then now let's come over here and reattach the air box on the other side. So then on the air box reattachment, where simply there's a nice hole here in the bottom that we got to line up with the intake tube, and then this little barb is going to go right into basically an elastic spring fitting at the bottom. Just like that. Now we'll put the air filter back in, or a new one obviously. And now we're going to reattach the air filter cover. Before we go too far, we need to make sure we reattach that hose clamp that we removed earlier, so we could get the air box out of the way. And then we're going to use a T25 to tighten up our airbox filter covers, screws. All right, our airbox is back in place. The last step is going to be then to put on the engine cover in the front. And that's going to go on with the last 3 screws that you should have remaining. And there you go, the car is all buttoned back up. All that remains is just to double check your work. So part of that means making sure your parts trays are completely empty, you don't have any extra screws sitting in there. Double check your connections. You've got this reattached up here and secured, your PCV hose resecured, all your bolts are tightened to spec, your spark plugs are back in. If you're this deep into a project, I would suggest pulling the dipstick and checking your oil. If you're this far into it, you might as well consider changing the oil. I did that as well. I didn't really include that in this video, but if you're this far into it, it's a piece of cake to change your oil. And so with that, that's all that there is to this project. I know it's a little, I don't know, it's probably not for a beginning do-it-yourself mechanic, but certainly manageable with I'll call it a reasonable set of tools. Questions or comments, put it down below. We always appreciate your feedback. Look forward to seeing you back here for another video. Click that subscribe button if you haven't already done so, and I'll see you back here soon. Have a great day. Bye.